Welcome to Roundtable Talk, a podcast about longevity, senior services marketing, and the quality of life as one ages. Roundtable Talk is brought to you by Pavone Group and Varsity, a senior services agency focused on helping clients win the mature market. If you like the fresh perspectives we deliver in each episode, please give Roundtable Talk a 5-star review on the podcast service of your choice.
Welcome everyone to Varsity's Roundtable Talk. Our very special guest today is Mo Rocca. Some of you may remember him from The Daily Show. Some may know him from his many appearances on NPR's Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, while others know him as a correspondent on CBS Sunday Morning. And let's not forget about Mobituaries, his terrific podcast about his favorite dearly departed people and things. Mo is also the author of Roctogenarians, a brand new book that tells the inspiring stories of people who followed their dreams and achieved success later in life. Mo, thank you so much for taking time to join us.
Derek, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you so much. And I don't know if you remember how we met, but it was actually at Katz in New York at the new production that they did downtown. What did you think of it?
Well, I loved it. But and my opinion, without sounding too egotistical, should carry some weight here because I have a very long history with Cats. As a child, I saw the original cast of Cats when I had just turned 14 years old, shortly after it opened, and I became obsessed with it. And then I ended up as an usher at the National Theater in Washington, D.C., ushering when the national tour came through. So I saw it about 30 more times because it played there a month. And I got a little tired of it, but I still had an attachment to it. I had the Cat sweatshirt, which was very on trend, right, for Broadway lovers with the two green eyes in the back. And I wore that almost every day during the winter at Pyle Junior High School in the 8th grade. This production, though, which is formerly called the Jellicle Ball, is so good, it's hard to believe that this isn't how Cats was intended to be performed in the first place. And I can't think of a higher compliment. I mean, it really seems like, oh, this is how it should be done. It's really fantastic. I urge anyone who has a chance to see it. And my understanding is that it will go to Broadway for an open-ended run. That's great. I did think it was a brilliant production. So thank you for sharing that. So at Varsity, celebrating life after 60, 70, 80, and beyond is really what we do. So I was excited when you wrote the book, Roctogenarians, about older adults who achieve success later in life. In it, you tell many people's stories, including Colonel Sanders, Morgan Freeman, Estelle Getty, and even Claire Peller, who was famous, of course, for Where's the Beef and the Wendy's commercials. What was the genesis of the book? What inspired you to write it? The genesis of the book, which might sound very transactional, is that Simon & Schuster, the publisher, actually came to me in this case and said, we want a book that will be especially relevant during the 2024 presidential election when it looked like it would be Biden versus Trump. I said, I'd like to write a book about people achieving great things in the last third of their lives, but I'm not interested in politics. So, and I say that without any shame. And I think probably a lot of people shared that opinion. And I'm at least not interested in writing about politics. And I also had nothing to say about the health of these candidates. I'm not a doctor. I don't even play one on TV. And you have to be a certain age to get that reference. And so I said, but I will write a book about people throughout history who have achieved greatness in the last third of their lives. And I teamed up with my Mobituaries co-writer, Jonathan Greenberg, and we had a great time. And it was honestly very inspiring for us as well, because we're both in our 50s and looking ahead to that chapter. That's great. Well, I love that. And I recognized a lot of the stories from profiles that you had done on CBS Sunday Morning, which I'm sure gave you a lot of great material. They did. And look, old people are my jam. I mean, on CBS Sunday Morning, if, a profile of a hot young Hollywood celebrity comes up and, different correspondents can jockey for it, I usually don't even compete. I'm not that interested. I'm interested in older people. When I created my cooking show, My Grandmother's Ravioli, which ran for 4 seasons on Cooking Channel, in which I went around the country learning to cook from grandmothers and grandfathers in their kitchen. I did it not so much because I wanted to learn how to cook, and I'm still pretty lousy in the kitchen, but because I really wanted to hear from people in their 70s, 80s, and even older, um, the values that had shaped their lives, what mattered to them at this stage in life. Um,
Well, that's great. That's great. What are you looking forward to as you age?
I'm looking forward to caring less about what other people think of me. That's one of that's one of the connections I think among the people in this book, is that they're very unfettered. They felt very free to act and to go for it because they weren't hamstrung by the opinions of other people. It's a quality I think that we ascribe to young people. Oh, she's go it alone. Oh, he's a rebel and does things his own way. But that's usually not the case. I think people in their 20s and 30s tend to care very much what other people think of them. And that's not always a bad thing, obviously. And I think a lot of young people figuring out who they are, to use modern parlance, crowdsource their decisions and even sometimes their own personalities, seeing what works, what gets a good response, what gets likes on social media. But people at the other end of life are not doing that. They're much more sure of who they are.
I couldn't agree more. I talk with, many older adults, and that's one of the things that they always say is they love that they don't have to worry about what other people are thinking, and that they can just be themselves, finally.
Yeah. And again, that word unfettered, it's something I keep thinking about. And one of the big surprises for me, I hope I'm not jumping the gun here, is that I had always assumed that the less time you have in front of you, the more fretful you might become. But it's actually the opposite. We found that the people that were of more advanced ages were actually much more able to live in the present. They weren't fixated on the future, and certainly, hopefully, not fixated on the past, because that does nobody any good unless you're a historian.
There you go. There you go. Well, speaking of history, you said that you put a lot of thought into liking the year that you were born, which would be 1969, a great year. But you said you'd have liked to have been born in 1888. Why?
Well, when I was thinking about years I would have liked to have been born, I put 1969 in the first position because I'm happy with how things have unfolded in my life. But then I thought, second choice, no, not 1968 or 1970, 1888. And I kind of gamed it out, and I would have loved to have been 12 years old at and I don't speak French, the fin de siècle, is that how you pronounce it?
Oh, yeah.
The turn of the century,
Yep.
at a very optimistic, exciting time. I would have loved to have been at the World's Fair in St. Louis, and not just because I love that movie, Meet Me in St. Louis, but what a great score. I would have liked to avoid being drafted for World War I. And we get into World War I, right, in 1918, the U.S. enters the war. So I would have been too old. I would have been 30. And I'm just not built for trench warfare. It's just not me. And then I would have loved to have been on the Orpheum circuit doing vaudeville, doing the Five a Day, meeting the Nicholas brothers, great acts like that. And then participating in early talkies, and then maybe at the end, in my last third, a la William Frawley doing character parts during early television. And then I die in the 1960s before everything goes to hell in a handbasket.
I love how much you've thought about this, and how you have it all organized. And
Well, you have to plan.
That's right. And I Teddy Roosevelt is my guy. I would have loved to have been alive during his presidency. I think that would have been really entertaining.
Well, I mean, yeah, to be a first-tier president without a war to fight. I mean, Lord knows he would have loved a war to fight. He tried very hard.
Right.
He went to, and I think put on his old uniform from the Spanish-American War and went to Woodrow Wilson, and said, "Would you let me enlist?" And but yeah, I mean, there's a reason that historians keep going back to him because he's just such an exciting figure.
Yeah, he's a character. So, how do you feel about retirement? On our first episode of Roundtable Talk, I had the honor of interviewing Garrison Keillor, and at 82 years of age, he's still very active, writing, touring, performing, with no true retirement in sight. What does retirement look like for you?
It's funny. I'm obviously pondering that question because I don't expect to ever retire. But what I'm thinking is, certainly things will evolve, and what will they look like? Um, all I can say is that I'm driven to make things interesting to people who didn't expect to be interested by them. That to me is very, very satisfying. If I say, I'm going to do a project, a book, a slideshow, a talk about one-term 19th century presidents, and there are a lot of those guys, stuffed between Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt, a lot of facial hair, usually from Ohio. And I love that you might say, really? And then by the end of it, be into it. And I think those things are always going to change. I want to make sure that I stay stimulated, that I don't rest on my laurels. And so I'm always excited for new ideas. Yeah. So I guess I just don't know what shape that will take. I don't think that I'll ever retire per se. And one thing is that I'm very fortunate. I don't like the word lucky for some reason, but I'm okay with fortunate. I'm fortunate that I love what I do. I try not to take that for granted. But you know how I know that I love what I do? Whenever Halloween comes up, I have no interest in putting on a costume. And I think it's because my work is play, and that's pretty exciting. So I don't feel the need to do it. So I think nothing against accountants, and I love mine. But I think if I worked at the IRS or something, I would probably really look forward to Halloween, to let her rip, to let my freak flag fly. Well, I can't believe I got that out of my mouth. But I don't feel that need because what I do is play.
That's great. That's great. And I have to say, you talk about some of those, 19th century presidents. I do a lot of travel in my work, and I'm sure I can give you credit for a lot of the interest because I do try to see the presidential sites as I travel, libraries, museums. I went to Millard Fillmore's house with a client because I remember seeing it, and I believe you're the correspondent who covered that and actually toured the house up in East Aurora.
I would not. You can have Jennifer Lawrence or Bruno Mars or Ryan Gosling, but Millard Fillmore is mine. That house in East Aurora that he built on his own. Yeah,
Yep.
Terrible president, terrible person.
Yeah.
But what a noodle roller, and that's not a euphemism. They actually have his noodle roller in the kitchen there.
That's right.
The docent posed with the noodle roller. Yeah,
that's right. I mean, we could go down a rabbit hole. I often wonder what it would be like if Zachary Taylor hadn't died. But hey, there we go. There we go.
Yeah, and then they went and they dug up his body, and what an anticlimax that was, because they thought they were going to find out that he'd been poisoned. But no, he just ate a giant bowl of cherries and guzzled down, chugged a big pitcher of ice cold milk, and basically exploded. I mean, bits of his body were found, I think, in Delaware. I mean, he's exploded all over Delmarva, the Delmarva Peninsula. I love the name Delmarva, by the way. Somebody should name their daughter Delmarva.
I wonder if there are any out there. In the Rita Moreno essay in Roctogenarians, you highlight the fact that at 93 or so, she said she didn't know how to make friends. I thought that was a really profound yet understandable kind of point of view. Have you found this with any of your other interview guests, things that you found to be really kind of profound or surprising?
Oh boy! Well, let me just say about Rita. One of the great things about interviewing her, and I had profiled her already 13 years before, when I thought she was kind of hanging it up. That's why I really wanted her in the book, because when I went to profile her, she'd written a memoir, and I thought, okay, this is her swan song. Instead, that memoir was more of a manifesto, a kind of call to action, because then she began a whole other career, basically, with movies, a stage show, television. I mean, it's really remarkable. And she really is still going strong at 93. But what I especially appreciated is how well she knew herself. And she really volunteered that. She said, that when she moved from her beautiful home in Oakland to sort of a senior living, not assisted living, but kind of a senior community, that she realized she didn't know how to make friends. And I found that so poignant and so, and the book, that kind of intimacy was it felt like an ingredient that we needed in the book, because people like Colonel Sanders, doing remarkable things is one thing, but Rita relearning how to make friends, I thought was really, really resonant, really special. I'm trying to think of other people who, I think Ruth Slenczynska, who had been the Shirley Temple of classical music when she was a global sensation in the 1930s and is today 100 years old. I profiled her when she was 97. And that to me was similarly poignant. She had substituted for Rachmaninoff when she was 9 years old. That's how remarkable a pianist and a child prodigy she was. But she had an abusive father, really terrible, and really had no childhood. And when I met her in her 90s, she had for the first time in her life carved a jack-o'-lantern. I mean, it was really almost like she had just come from another planet because because she hadn't experienced these things. But one thing she said to me that had a similar kind of impact to what Rita said about making friends is she said to me about playing the piano now again as a much older person. She said, well, you don't really become a good player until you're 60. And I said, what do you mean? She said, well, the notes are same. The notes are the same, but the story you tell is different. And I loved that because it wasn't. She wasn't being Pollyanna. She wasn't saying, "Oh, you can become a virtuoso at 70 or something." But what she was saying is that as an older person, as a musician, and somebody who obviously already had technique, that she was able to bring something new to it that she couldn't as a young woman.
That's great. Yeah, I really was surprised by that story when I first saw it on CBS Sunday Morning because she lives just 2 towns away from me. I live in Hershey, Pennsylvania, and she's in Annville.
Okay,
So,
yeah.
and I saw that she'd been doing concerts around the area, and I never knew. I wish I would have gone to one of her concerts.
Right, yeah.
She's amazing. She's the last
woman.
living student of Rachmaninoff, isn't she?
Oh my God, for sure. For sure. I mean,
Yeah.
Somebody could back check that, but it's hard to believe that anybody else is alive that studied with Rachmaninoff.
So have you found a common thread among all the stories that you tell in the book?
Well, I found several. We found, and I have to give, of course, again, credit to my co-author, Jonathan Greenberg. I think we thought about this sort of after the fact or during the writing, but then we're looking at the stories sort of from a distance afterwards. A few occurred, and I've mentioned a couple. I think one of which is, I think, it's a generality that the older you get, the less you care about what other people think of you. I think that there is, in many different ways, or several different ways at least, a return to childhood. Sometimes in a literal or literary vein. Frank McCourt with Angela Zash is writing about his childhood. Laura Ingalls Wilder writing about her childhood on the prairie. There is a return to childhood in terms of completing something that was started. Where there's a section of the book called Unfinished Business. Queen guitarist Brian May returning at the age of 60 to complete his PhD in astrophysics, or Diana Nyad returning and finally achieving her dreamed of swim from Cuba to Key West at age 64, something she first attempted when she was 28. And I think there's also, among a lot of these people, the key is that they view endings as beginnings. They don't view endings as endings. So the story of Henri Matisse, unable to paint in his 70s because of stomach cancer, trading in his paintbrush for a giant pair of scissors and beginning the paper cutouts, that would have made him a legend if he only had done that, is really inspiring because those are choices. I think it was instinctual for him. I don't think he needed a pep talk or to be instructed. He was an artist and he had not finished creating. I think, there are other similarities. A lot of these people, there's a section called It's About Time, about people who did achieve greatness earlier in life, but were only recognized, thank God, while they were still alive, but very late in life. And all three of the people in that section had marriages that lasted about 60 years and had spouses that really kept them going. But I think ultimately what really binds all these people together is that chromosomally, they're the same as you and me. Well, I guess, right? I mean, you get what I'm driving at, that these aren't superhumans.
Absolutely.
They're not a different species. These are people. And obviously, some of them, like Matisse or Slenczynska, had very particular outsized talents. But others, their talents were grit and optimism, and creativity, but they weren't necessarily geniuses.
Great point. I love that with Ruth Strozinski, how you were saying that she kind of rediscovered her childhood because she hadn't really had at least a happy childhood, and fascinating. Did any of the stories?
I think that. Oh, forgive me, Derek.
No.
I think that it's important to point out also that this return to childhood. It's, when Matisse begins doing those cutouts, he himself said that it was sort of a return to childhood, that it lacked complication. And I think that, and he was drawn by the big shapes and bright colors. So I think it's important to emphasize that what he's describing is childlike, not childish. But I think there's a lot to be said for that, for sort of the brush sort of clearing away and being able to see with a kind of clarity that maybe you saw with as a child, but now you have all this other experience and talent and perspective. So all to say, it can be a wonderful, wonderful time creatively.
That's great. Did any of these stories particularly surprise you as you dug in?
I'm trying to think in terms of particular. I mean, so many of them were surprises to me because I didn't know them. I think I knew that there were kinds of stories that I wanted, and our researcher Zoe Marcus helped in a lot of cases find these people to fit the bill. So, I knew I wanted to include a civil rights figure who was elderly, because we think of the civil rights movement, for good reason, as being led by young, very courageous people like John Lewis, who's 25 when he leads marchers across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, or the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. being 34 when he delivered the I Have a Dream speech. But I knew vaguely that there were older people in the front lines, but I didn't know anything about Mary Church Terrell, who was 86 when she led sit-ins at Washington, D.C. lunch counters in the 1950s to fight, the laws of that allowed the, segregation of public accommodations, which, I mean, still, when you think about the Citadel of Liberty, the Washington, D.C., having segregated public accommodations as late as the 1950s is just shocking, right? And she was somebody. And part of what I found so powerful about that story is that someone of that age doing that is not fighting for a better world for themselves, because at best she would enjoy that world if she were successful for a couple of years. And indeed, she died at 90 shortly after the Supreme Court upheld, or conferred victory on her side. It's the case that her protest sort of set the stage for, went all the way to the Supreme Court. But so I suppose her story was a surprise because I didn't know the details of it. But yeah.
That's a great point. Now, have you seen the musical Suffs?
I've not.
Okay,
should I?
You absolutely should. It's a great show. It is actually closing January 5th, but Mary Church Terrell is certainly a character in that, along with Ida B. Wells and others. So I really, really enjoyed it. But
I have to tell you, Derek, I'm kind of embarrassed that I didn't know that she's a character in there. It's been a busy time, but that really makes me want to see it because it's an amazing story.
It really is. It really is. So, were there any stories that you particularly connected with that you were telling or that you uncovered?
I think that I think I found very, I connected with so many of them. I think in terms of hoping that I can emulate many of these people. I think one that I was particularly touched by was Frank McCourt. I think that someone who struggles with whether his story is worth telling, I think it's very, very poignant. And Frank McCourt didn't believe that his story was worth telling. He also was afraid and ashamed to tell it, ashamed of the poverty he grew up in. His students, to whom he told stories of his childhood, really just to keep them in the tent and focused in the classroom, urged him to write down his story. He was friends with successful writers who told him the same thing. But there was something telling him both, no, your story isn't worth telling, but there was also clearly something urging him to do it. And he finally decided that he would, in his own words, die howling if he didn't get his story out. And did I connect with that? I certainly was very moved by that. And when he finally did write Angela's Ashes, he said, it took me 2 years and all of my life to write this story.
It's beautiful. So you mentioned in the introduction of Roctogenarians about meeting Chance the Rapper and coming to grips that you'll likely never be a successful rapper. Maybe that's true, but do you still have an unrealized dream?
Well, let me first say that I took away a slightly different message from my encounter with Chance the Rapper. It was 2015, and I was making an appearance on Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me on NPR, and he was our guest, and the crowd was going crazy. And we were asking him, it's what we do on the show, kind of hopefully fun, goofball questions. And I asked him, I said at the time I was 46, I said, I'm 46, is it too late for me to become a rapper? And then he said, without skipping a beat, he said, I don't know, some people might say it's too soon. And people laughed and the conversation moved on. But I really was kind of thunderstruck and embarrassed by the exchange, because I think every joke or jokey question comes from a real place. And I think, and I didn't realize this until after the fact, I think that I asked that question because I had begun thinking of myself as over the hill at 46, and which is insane. And that's not to say that I could become a successful rapper. It's not my ambition, and I think I point out my beatboxing is pretty lousy. But I think my question and his answer unearthed a real truth. That in my case, that I'd fallen into the trap of thinking of myself as over the hill. And his point, I think, which is kind of profound, that, sometimes even at what we think of as middle-aged, we're still not there yet. We're still too young. We still haven't developed a voice, and to be a good rapper, to be a good performer in any medium, you need something to say. So I found the whole exchange kind of caused me to hit reset and snap out of it. Yeah.
That's interesting. When it was probably just going to be a seemingly lighthearted moment, that it had that kind of a profound effect on you.
I think, yeah. And I think the host of the show, my friend Peter Sagal, I think the co-panelists there probably thought nothing of it. But he said it with such seriousness. And I thought, that's real insight. That's real insight. You don't know. It's sometimes too young. You're sometimes too young. I've wanted for years, I thought I wanted to do stand-up comedy. And I've approached it. I've done versions of it. I've done short sets with other people. But that's something where you really need to know what you want to say. And that takes time.
Great point.
So who knows? I might be doing stand-up when I'm in my 70s. I mean that.
Hacks is one of my favorite shows right now.
Right. It's terrific.
Yeah. So you write in the book that when something ends, we must think that something begins, which is also really profound. Have you found that to be true? When something ends, we must think that something begins.
Well, it's certainly true for people in the book, people like Matisse or Borges, who wrote short stories before he lost his sight and then began composing poetry because it's something he could do in his head. So I think that's part of what survival is about. And I'm trying to think from my own life, when something ends, something begins. I mean, well, a very dramatic example. I'm not sure that it quite fits in here. It might be a little bit of a stretch, but my late in life, I'm going to call it triumph, is that my husband and I are now fathers to a baby girl. We are our first time fathers.
Congratulations.
And so, well, thank you so much. And if you hear a little bit of crying in the background, it's because she's in the other room, and trust me, she's being taken care of. I haven't just left her there.
That's
but let's just
fantastic.
say my life as someone without children has ended, and boy, what a great thing to begin.
That's great. That's great. Well, well said. And how old is she, if I may ask?
10 weeks.
Oh, wow.
She's fantastic. She's got a keen sense of irony, a sly wit. I mean, her personality is terrific. She's great. And, in all seriousness, she's a very logical crier, which is really great. Like, if she cries, it's because she's hungry, she's tired, or her diaper's wet. And
you can address it and move on.
Yeah, there's not a lot of you don't have to sort of divine why she might be crying. There's no mystery crying. And that may change over time, and she's entitled to cry just because she wants to cry, by all means. And I might even love her more when she's crying. I mean, she's just, my God. But right now it's sort of like, oh, okay, I get why you're crying. And then we deal with it, and then we move on.
That's great. So I have to ask, are you running on fumes, or are you well rested? Because 10 weeks,
I'm pretty well rested, I have to say, because she's a really good sleeper. But yeah, I mean, here's the thing. People keep saying to me, and I get it, they're like, oh, get set to never sleep again. And it's not that I'm annoyed by that. I'm not annoyed, but I have begun responding more bluntly, which is, I haven't slept in 20 years. I'm going to be fine. And I really haven't. I no longer, but at one point I had 6 different jobs. So I'll be fine.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, what a joy. What a pleasure it is to have kids. So that's great. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Somebody
told me today, somebody I ran into said to me today, talking about his son, he said, I'm so bummed. I said, why? And he said, Angelo lost the baby smell. He no longer has that baby smell. And I said, I'm sorry for your loss. He said, yeah, it's a bummer. This man adores his son, adores him. But, so I mean, the baby, anyway, the baby smells great.
That's great. Yeah, we have a 25-year-old son, and each of the stages are great. And you miss each one, but each new stage brings different joys.
Well, I'm happy to hear that, and I believe that.
Yeah. So another question that I wanted to ask. In the book, you talk about Carl Reiner. I love how you call them the Norman Lear players. I don't know if you coined that or if
I did, yeah.
If that was something out there, but I love that. But Carl Reiner said that the key to longevity is to interact with other people. Obviously, you interact with people all day, every day, throughout your career. Would you agree to that?
Yeah, I think so. And, I think it's also a less cliched way of saying the key to longevity is laughter. Or laughter keeps you young, which, by the way, I also think is true. And when somebody like Norman Lear tells you that, you better believe it. It's not like, the person responsible for a good proportion of what we've laughed at over the last 50 years, when you had to take what he says seriously. But I think while laughter is absolutely wonderful, I think really it's about engagement. Mel Brooks, Norman Lear, and Carl Reiner. Mel Brooks is still with us, but all of them really lived by that. I mean, their old age has been fruitful and happy, I think, because of their just constant engagement.
That's great. So how can we as a society change our perception of aging to see it more as a time for new beginnings rather than winding down? Are there any greater lessons that we can take away, in your opinion?
Well, I think when we're my age and younger, I'm 55, we can help set the stage for ourselves by not being afraid of older people and not being afraid of interacting or learning from them. I mean, there's this sort of insidious idea that um, they're preventing younger people from, gaining promotions, moving up the food chain. And that's just not how the economy works. That's not how things work. And so I think by valuing what they can bring, and now we can help set the stage for ourselves to be valued. That's one thing. I mean, we quote Louise Aronson, who wrote a landmark book, a gerontologist who wrote a landmark book called Elderhood, in the preface, because she had said, we've added these 20 years onto our lives and we haven't figured out what to do with them. So if you can retire in your 60s, great, go for it. But there are so many people that aren't ready to, and shouldn't, because they don't want to, and they're perfectly capable. And so there's all this talent, and we actually really do need the talent. The population may be aging, but it's also tapering off, and which is a big fear that a lot of people have right now. So the more the merrier to keep this society, functioning. Yeah.
That's great. And that's an interesting quote. We've added 20 years to our life, but we haven't figured out what to do with it. Is that
That's
quote,
right.
roughly?
I mean, look, granted, when you say the greatest generation, their life expectancy was a lot shorter. Of course, some of that is because of infant mortality, but it really was significantly shorter. And so there are all there's these extra decades of life. And so I think we need to reassess, what it means to be, 80 right now.
Absolutely.
I mean, I have in my life octogenarians and nonagenarians who are in very good health and are perfectly capable of contributing, of working, and I can say, this is just anecdotal, the much older people that I know tend to get a lot less distracted, tend to write emails, say, that drop a lot of fewer words because they're not doing 3 or 4 things at once. So there's a lot that generation brings to the table.
Sure. Well said. Well said. Well, as we talked earlier, I mentioned I'm a fan of presidential history, and I heard the biographer of James Garfield, C.W. Goodyear, when he was on his book tour recently, say that as a biographer, you're not supposed to necessarily like or dislike your subject. How do you feel about that? I mean, when you're now, I know you haven't written like a full-on biography, but you've interviewed, you've profiled, you've met a lot of people. Do you try to stay neutral, or how do you view your role as a correspondent?
It depends on what kind of a piece I'm doing. In obituaries, which were my version of obituaries, I err on the side of generosity, just as most obituaries do in your newspaper. There's so many different ways to tell a person's story, and so if you're going to err one side or the other, on one side or the other, being generous is just as valid as being more critical. I mean, you're never going to get it in trying to sum up somebody's life. You're never going to get it perfectly right in that many inches. I think spiritually, there's also something to be said for a kind of humility when you're telling someone's story, and not assuming, especially when you're talking about the past, that you're more enlightened, that we're more enlightened. I don't know that that's true. And I don't know that that's true at all. And to remember that 100 years from now, people may look back at us as barbaric. How we treat cancer springs to mind. It may be, and hopefully it will be, that in 100 years they'll be saying they pumped chemicals into people. What was that? So we should really clip our own wings.
That's interesting.
I think. I do think when I read presidential biographies, that whole cottage industry of presidential history, and I'm an avid consumer of it, I do think there's a danger of biographers falling in love with their subjects, and this is related, centering them too much. I remember, I'm going to get the names wrong here, reading a biography of Woodrow Wilson. And granted, it was a biography of Woodrow Wilson. He was president, but he was the paramount figure in every aspect, according to this historian, that it began to feel skewed. There was a really powerful Congress. That's how the League of Nations, why the United States didn't join the League of Nations. So the characters tend to become outsized, tend to become such above the title film stars that it starts to give a distorted view of what the world was like at that point. So I think that's a related problem to falling in love with your subject, is making your subject more important than he or she may actually have been. I work in shorter form, and I also gravitate, it's a little bit quirky in my CBS Sunday Morning pieces, towards lousy one-term presidents from the past that are largely forgotten. And I certainly don't celebrate them. If anything, I had to check myself against being too critical or even dismissive of the Millard Fillmores, the Franklin Pierces, the James Buchanans.
Sure. That's interesting. I was at the. It is interesting when you go to the James Buchanan House, Wheatland, or Grover Cleveland's birthplace. You know, the docents and Franklin Pierce. I remember, the docents are all, of course, saying that they're the best president ever, and really advocating for their legacy. But
well, I've always been far more intrigued by the docents at the marginalized history sites than, I get that whoever's running tours at Monticello, at Mount Vernon, at Hyde Park, they're top tier, probably. But come on, the visitors are already in awe when they walk in. But if you're working at the Benjamin Harrison House in Indianapolis on Delaware Avenue, you really got to sell, because half the people walking in there are there to use the bathroom.
I remember being at Kinderhook up in Martin Van Buren's home,
house.
and talking to the folks from the Park Service and thinking, boy, this is quite an assignment. But
what a beautiful house, and those trees.
Yep, absolutely. So, and by the way, Woodrow Wilson is a major character in Suffs as well, because of he's not treated very kindly in the whole suffrage suffrage history. But while we're on the subject, what president do you admire most, and why? If that's a fair question.
Well, I mean, I'm a fan of Teddy Roosevelt just because of the enthusiasm, and to become a first tier president without a war under your watch, like I said before, is you have to be an invigorating figure. And so, how can you not love someone who loved the job that much?
That's great. Well said. So, what presidents have taught us lessons that we can learn from as we age?
Interesting. What presidents have taught us lessons? I guess the easiest answer, but the first that springs to mind, is Jimmy Carter, because it's
I was thinking the same thing.
A mixed single term in office, and I realize a lot of people want to say that his term in office was much more successful, but it's not Mount Rushmore worthy, no matter how much you want to spin it. But whatever motivated him afterwards, and we can only assume the best, to be a citizen of the world that way is remarkable. I mean, it's just is so admirable. And as somebody who does his own version of obits, I always wonder about that all-important first line of his New York Times obit, how it's changed over the years. Had he died in the 80s versus 1990s versus the early O's versus the teens, and now into the 2020s. That first line it will rightly be weighted much more towards his post-presidency than it would have been before.
It's a great point. So many of those listening, may know you from CBS Sunday Morning, while others remember you from The Daily Show. How would you contrast your experience from The Daily Show with your experience on CBS Sunday Morning? How are they different? How are they the same? I first really enjoyed your work on The Daily Show. That's, I think, how I first became aware of you and your work.
Those two gigs are much more similar than you'd think. And in my mind, not having to say in my mind, not just in my mind. I think that objectively they're much more similar than you would think. You know, in The Daily Show, a lot of what my work was about and the field pieces that you would do was satirizing bubble-headed news correspondents and the whole format. Some would say pretty stilted, pretty brittle of television news. But in CBS Sunday Morning, I'm oftentimes and hopefully judiciously using humor where it helps to tell a story. But in both, you're telling short form stories. In The Daily Show, those pieces were about 3 minutes, sometimes a little less, rarely more than 4. CBS Sunday Morning, they're anywhere between 3.5 and 11. But it's still about telling a story. And those are skills I learned from writing for a PBS kids show called Wishbone. That's where I really learned how to do that. That's where that toolbox came from. So it's about honing, chiseling, polishing, making sure you're being as economical as possible, and connecting with people at home.
That's great. Maybe you're talking about Wishbone on your podcast, Obituaries.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, when is the new season coming out?
We are on hiatus right now. It is, Derek, it is a very heavy lift. There's nothing more boring than telling people how hard you work. And so I want to make sure that I don't give myself a pity party here, but it is hard work. So we'll see. I mean, but it's, I'd love it to continue because I've loved doing it. It's been a real passion project.
Well, that's great. And I do realize with that podcast, there's a lot of research. There's a lot of, a lot of background that goes into it beyond just simply having conversations like we're having today. Not that this is easy for you to take the time to join, but it is a very different animal. But we're just launching. We've just had a few episodes now of Roundtable Talk. What advice do you have for me or for us as we're embarking on this? From your experience as a storyteller, as a podcaster, et cetera.
It is a more intimate medium. Obituaries, each is like, not to sound too grand about it, but I don't want to be mock humble about it. They're audio documentaries. However, keeping things personal, keeping some of the rough edges so that it doesn't feel too polished and manicured, I think is important. I think it's that kind of grit gives people something to cling on to, and sets things apart. I mean, I think of that Sondheim lyric from Sunday in the Park with George. Anything you do, let it come from you, then it will be new. So whatever the topic is, even if the interviewee has been 1,000 other places talking about it, if you as the interviewer and the producer are committed to making it special and individual, it'll stand out. I mean, I think that's one thing I can say. And then the note that I always hate is when people say to keep it short, but I guess it's true that people, but I'm not sure. I still don't know about that because there are plenty of things like Joe Rogan, isn't that podcast that goes on for a long time, and what a hit that is. So, but I think, trusting in your own individual instincts is probably a good thing, because that's what the audience may not consciously realize it, but they'll glom onto it if it feels real.
That's great. Thank you. I appreciate that. And at the beginning, we were kind of chatting before we started rolling, and you said, let's just start rolling. This is, this is some interesting stuff when we're talking about cats and some of the other things. So I appreciated that, that advice. So last question that we're going to ask every guest: what have you learned that you wish you could have told your younger self?
Oh, I mean, two things, I think. Just stop worrying, number one. It's not going to get you anywhere. The second thing I'm a little less sure of, I'm sure of that, what I just said, is taking time each day to just enjoy yourself is vitally important. But the only reason I'm not, even though that sounds like irreproachable, the only reason I'm putting a little asterisk next to it is because there's so many different kinds of enjoyment. So there are days when I've worked myself to the bone, start to finish, and I've enjoyed it, which is different than the kind of enjoyment I get from walking all the way home from work and just listening to songs through my earbuds that I love. And that's kind of a footloose and fancy-free, light feeling that's wonderful. So they're very different kinds of enjoyment. Yeah.
That's great. That's beautiful. And it is important, I mean, it sounds trite, but, stop and smell the roses. And some of those kinds of things are, I think, important lessons that we all need to learn as life gets busier and faster.
That's why everybody should read the play Our Town or see a production of it.
We're going in December. Looking forward to seeing Jim Parsons in it. So interesting. Well, thank you again. Pick up the book Roctogenarians by Mo Rocca, and the book Mobituaries. Check out the podcast. I listen to it on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. There are 4 seasons out there, and I hope there'll be a 5th, but at least there are 4 to enjoy. So can't thank you enough. You've been very generous with your time today. Mo Rocca, thank you.
Thank you, Derek.
And I'd also like to thank Dave Schaffner, our producer, and Matt Campbell, our engineer, for putting this all together. So we'll see you on the next episode of Varsity Roundtable Talk.